welcome to Pensions Awareness Week 2022. My name is Olive Ryan and I'm Head of Client Services at moneycube.ie. And we're delighted again to be taking part in this exciting event over the course of the next week, where we'll be talking about pensions and how to make it simpler for people to understand, how to get started, and how to continue your journey through your pension lifetime right up to retirement years. But today we're going to be talking about a really important topic, and that is about the pension gender gap. And we all, I suppose, are aware of the gender pay gap, and maybe not as aware of the fact that there is also a gender pension gap as well. Joining me today to talk about this interesting topic is a panel of experts from across the pensions industry, and also an employer who will give us a real life example of this in the workplace. Starting with Moya Murdoch, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Insurance Ireland. We have Terry Kelly-Orris, who is the Chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force with Insurance Ireland, and also Head of Public Policy in Irish Life. And finally, Maeve McLean, who is the Chief People Officer in Lidl Ireland. So I suppose today's topic is going to cover, hopefully, exposing what is the gender pension gap in Ireland, what we can do about it, what causes it, and how we can address it from all levels, from both individual and employer, as well as from a government and industry level as well. And so I will start, maybe, Moya. In Insurance Ireland, you have conducted some research, and I'm just going to read an opening paragraph from that paper that you had released earlier this year. You say research from the ESRI in 2019 demonstrates that there is a gender pension gap in Ireland in the region of 35%, with the retired man receiving an average €150 per week more than the retired woman. And it also shows that women have smaller pension pots than men, and they also live longer, meaning that pension pot has to last for longer. So Moya, maybe that's quite stark, and I don't know that people listening today will actually realise that there's a 35% difference in pension income. I mean, we talk a lot about the pay gap for genders, but not really touching on this topic about the pension gap. Maybe you could explain a bit more about that gap, what it's about and what's causing it.
Yes, Olive, as you say, we're all very familiar with the work that's ongoing to close the pay gap, the gender pay gap, which is unacceptable, and it's taking time to close that. But one of the more subtle consequences of the pay gap, but also as a result of other factors, is the pension gap. And all too often we don't think about our pensions until much later in life, when we're maybe limited in what we can do. And as you say, research by the ESRI and also Insurance Ireland have demonstrated, on average, when a woman retires at the same age as a man, their pay income per week would be approximately €280 versus the male equivalent of €433. So in hard cash terms, that's the difference we're talking about. So we're all working away there, putting our shoulder to the grindstone, and we come to enjoy life as we retire and look forward to getting around to doing things that we want to do and hadn't got time. We were time poor and money rich, but now we might find ourselves in a situation where we don't have the actual resources to enjoy the things we'd been looking forward to. Our lifestyles aren't going to change dramatically when we retire. There's no reason to think that a woman should be prepared to accept a much lower income than while they're working. But this almost unconscious bias is going to result in women having to manage and live longer, as you say, on a much smaller pension pot. And it is sadly a fact of life that women will outlive their male counterparts and will have to survive on a much lower pension pot to start with. So it's a very important topic for Insurance Ireland and all of our life and pension members. And it's something that I believe, as Chief Executive of Insurance Ireland, that we can bring influence in terms of the policy makers to address that gap. And I think the sooner we do it, the better, because it's occurring at the early stages of a woman's career, when it's so important to be thinking about the long-term financial security of yourself and your family and your dependents, that you are thinking the impact of actually suspending contributions for whatever reason whether it's maternity leave or carers leave. And the reality is women do have to perform most of those carer duties, and they are obviously the only ones who can give birth. So they have to take the time off on maternity leave. So we need to make sure that they aren't penalised for that element of their career, and that we facilitate and bring transparency to the whole issue of pensions and women's pensions as they progress through their careers.
And talking about there now about the causes of it, and you mentioned maternity leave, and is that really the crux behind it? Is it the fact that there is leave, those carer kind of type leave is usually in
well, generally
women's?
speaking, yes. When a woman goes on maternity leave, she either goes down to a much lower rate of pay, or if they decide to take extended leave, there isn't any contributions in general going into those pension pots while they're off on time, looking after the new baby, whatever. So that's a significant contributory factor, and it's something that women themselves don't think about very much until later in life, and they're wondering why their pension pot is much smaller. I know at those times, on that lower rate of pay, obviously times are a little bit more constrained, but it's really important that employers, legislators and policymakers take into account the importance of sustaining contributions throughout all periods of a woman's career. Later in life, often you may have to take time off to look after a loved one because of whatever reason. An older member of the family, your mother, father, may need attention and may need specific care. And again, by and large, it does fall on the shoulders of the woman. And at the moment, there's inadequate provision made to allow women to have some sort of sustainability on their contributions there. So there are lots of reasons, not to mention the pay gap itself, in that a lot of women are on lower pay for equivalent work. So that is all contributing to that final pension pot. And at most critical years, whenever early on in your career, it is really important to be contributing, because a pension takes time to mature, to grow in terms of value for investments. You don't want to leave it till it's too late and you can't actually reverse that downturn. So there are a number of reasons, and they're all quite obvious when you think about it, but at the time you don't think about it.
And I think that's what we're trying to get to here this week, is that these are things that are happening under the radar, almost in plain sight, you know, that we just don't think of the consequence. And you mentioned good points there about the fact that you're planning a maternity leave and maybe even return to work part-time, which a lot of women would do after children are born. So taking into account the longer term impact of that change. Terry, I know in Irish Life you have been really researching into this a lot. I know the two of us talked about this a couple of years ago for Pensions Awareness Week. We touched on it as well. But it's something you're quite passionate about, and you've done quite a lot of research, I think, in Irish Life. Maybe you'll tell us a bit about that and your findings there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a look within our kind of defined contribution pension schemes, and we looked at over 80,000 pension pots, and this is everything from kind of the very large employers to the small, so we didn't differentiate. And we had a look, and we did find a salary gap, or we did find a pensions gap there. So then we decided to kind of do some kind of good analysis underneath to see what was causing this. So there were some interesting findings, because you often heard some myths around pensions and women and what was causing it. So the first thing we found was where women were offered a pension in employment, they were more likely to take the pension than a man was. The second thing was women were more likely to start their pension earlier than a man was. So age wasn't a factor, or engaging with the pension wasn't a factor. Women were also more likely to be active in their pension scheme than a man was. And the one which, you know, we often hear is, oh, women are more risk adverse and it was an investment thing. When we delved down into the investment options that were being pursued, actually there was very little difference. So investment is not impacting in relation to what's going on with the pension. The other big factor as well, which we looked at was, well, is it AVCs? Like, is there a differentiation between men and women? Because again, often you hear, you know, kind of men are more involved and more engaged with their money. AVCs, exactly the same. Percentages going in, exactly the same. In fact, slightly higher maybe sometimes for women. So the big two differentiators then, when you drilled down through the actual data, were, as Moya has already said, one was salary. That there is, you know, kind of when we look at what's there is a differentiation, and this was all the way through the spectrum. And the second one was the periods of unpaid leave. And then we did some projections in relation to if you have two equivalent employees on exactly the same salary, so a man and a woman in their 30s, what happens if the woman goes out on maternity leave and takes 3 years out, which, you know, between, you know, a bit of unpaid leave and a bit of part-time when you come back and everything else, and you then project that forward, and that creates a huge gap. And in particular, in your 30s, because of compounding on pensions and investments. And it's very difficult then when you come back into the office. One, most people forget. So, you know, personally, I remember going on maternity leave. We worked out the maths at home. If I took 16 weeks unpaid leave, what would that do to the salary and how do we adjust? Never, ever thought of the pension, right? And then when you do come back to work, you know, you have other costs coming through and everything else. So, you know, primarily it is the two factors, which are the salary, and the second one is the unpaid leave. And there was European work done to say, you know, both Italy and Ireland have the longest periods of time when women are out of the workforce. So, you know, your average working thing. And, you know, pensions are geared and have been structured on a 40-year career horizon. They don't cater for the blocks and the gaps that happen along the way. And in Ireland, it can be anything between 5 and 7 years. You take 5 to 7 years out in your 30s and early 40s, it's very difficult to make that gap back up again. So having done all of that research, we then looked at the Irish Life scheme and said, well, do we have a problem? And yes, we did have a problem. And one of the things that we did is our very clever actuaries ran the numbers and figured out that when somebody comes back off maternity leave, we increase our employer contributions for the year that that person comes back. So again, it happens straight after you come back. So again, you're still obviously in your 30s or in your 40s, but it's very soon. And that increase in contributions for the year that returns on the employer side basically smooths that gap for employees. So interesting that a lot of the myths around the pensions and women and investments didn't hold true. But yeah, crystallized the fact that really it's those times of unpaid leave that are really causing your problems.
Yeah, it's amazing. And like that, you know, that factor about the time frame, like that, you know, exactly when women are probably most likely to take time out from employment is when it's going to have the worst impact for them on that pension fund at the end. That's fascinating. And it's really interesting to hear what action Irish Life took themselves to address it, you know, to support that change for women coming back.
Yeah, absolutely. And the big key learning there was one, obviously the financial contribution, but also the education. So like educating our own employees that, you know, do you know you have a gap and this is what we're going to try and do to smooth it out. But also kind of educating our own clients and, you know, women in the workforce that, you know, when you're working out your maths in relation to those periods of unpaid leave, just factor in your pension, and your pension is going to be worth a lot more to you than your salary will at a given point in time. So actually that 16 weeks you're going to miss, or that 26 weeks that you're going to take out, when you roll it up, it's going to be a multiple of that on the back end.
Yeah, absolutely. And Maeve, in Lidl, touching on that point that Terry made about, you know, the impacts that employers can have, what they can do to educate and to encourage women in the workplace. Lidl have done a huge amount of work recently on this topic, on the pay gap in particular, and you've had some great success recently in changing that and reducing it by 30% in 1 year. And you also have a great mentorship program. I know you're a great advocate for keeping women in the workforce, and you have a mentorship program to help that. So maybe you might tell us a bit more about what Lidl are doing to help with this aspect of the pay, which also, as Moya has pointed out, will affect the pension gap as well.
Yeah, both Moya and Terry have referred to, I mean, that pay is a factor, the time out of work is a factor as well. For us, it's about being as an inclusive employer as we can so that women stay in the workforce for as long as possible. And that's about a myriad of different benefits and policies to support women throughout their career, from very early on right through. Education is a huge part of that. A lot of our policies, they're not expensive policies, they're policies around educating women and the broader workforce as well. It's really important to us. We have 5,500 employees in the Republic of Ireland, and 46% of those are women, 54% men. So we have a very large cohort of women in the business, and it makes business sense for us to keep those women in work for as long as possible. So a number of different things that we've done. We've looked at introduction of a fertility policy, where we support women at that time in their life where they're looking to start a family. Another example would be we have fully paid maternity for all of our employees, and that's regardless of those who work in stores, warehouses, or in an office function, which is really important as well, that it's not just a benefit that's there for higher paid or higher earners, but also for right throughout the organisation, that we have an occupational pension scheme. Part of that was not just having the scheme, but it's about making sure that everybody knows it's there, and that so as soon as you become eligible to join the scheme, you get an appointment with a financial advisor. I know with some companies it's a case of it's there, if you know about it you have to go figure it out. For us it was really, really important, I suppose like a duty of care to our employees in the long term as well, that they have access to. So appointment made with a financial advisor. I'm personally really grateful that in my 30s, very early on, that I had signed up to our pension scheme without really realising, now I do, at this stage in my life, how important it was that I started that early. As Terry said, when you sit down then, what's really important is to educate women on, it's not just about the salary loss. Like that was something that we talked about earlier on, that is, you know, it's fascinating for me, and that's the stuff that we have to do more of now. It's educating around the pension gap and what that might look like. So we have fully paid maternity for all of our employees, so our pension contributions continue. But then we do need to look at, for the unpaid leave, what does that mean? Are there more things that we can do for employees as well? We removed the retirement age recently. Not that we want everybody to be forced to work until they're 70, but there are so many people who financially are not in a position to retire at 65. So having a mandatory retirement age in our contracts really didn't make sense. And in practice, a lot of the time, we were having conversations with people who wanted to stay on, and we were making adjustments. So we've just removed the mandatory retirement age. And also now, that means that we will continue to contribute into the pension then beyond 65 as well, which is hugely important. And they're the kind of things as an employer that we need to look at. How do we make it a more inclusive place for women to stay longer, to feel supported at the various different stages of their life, and now to tackle not just the gender pay gap, which we had looked at, and we do have a gap. So we have equal rates of pay throughout the organisation, but because we have more men in more senior positions, it does create a bit of a gap. It's 6.2%, it's less than what the European average is or the Irish average is, but there's still a bit of work to be done there. But definitely now, educating us as an employer means that we have more to do now on the gender pension gap as well.
And I mean, they're not, like you say, they were simple and not expensive changes that you made in
not necessarily,
there are ways for employers to make changes that can.
If you look at our menopause policy, that doesn't actually cost anything, but it's about educating women and men in the organisation as to what it's about, what does it mean, how does it impact in the workforce, why does it matter, about the business sense of keeping women with 30 years experience in the workforce for longer. So a lot of those policies, hugely supportive. It's about minor adjustments in work. It's not about necessarily completely changing somebody's job either. It's about maybe making minor adjustments and minor changes, again, to feel included and to feel like you belong and to want to stay in work for longer and not be one of the 25% of women who ends up quitting work because of menopausal symptoms. That doesn't cost. That's about compassion, it's about listening, and it's about being open-minded on what does flexibility look like. And it'll look different. It'll look different from a store employee to get them off the till for 5 minutes as they're having, whatever that might be, or an office employee. So things like that to support women in the workplace I think that there are more things that employers can do.
An equally undiscussed topic, the menopause for women as well. So
Yes.
that's great to see Little taking that on board. You know, it's all about education, really, isn't it? Making people aware and educating people. Another topic that's coming up that I don't think people are very aware about either is auto enrollment. And I know Moya and Terry, you both have had some opinions on this of what you have seen in the proposals so far. So you might maybe Moya, I'll get you to explain first, what is auto enrollment? What's it going to look like?
Yeah, auto enrollment has been in the news and has been on the agenda for quite a number of years. It's been really in the mixing machine for a long time, and this government has really committed to introducing it in 2023, and we have seen the design principles coming out, and you know, it will go some way to addressing the pension coverage issue that this country is facing.
And that's what it's trying to do. At the heart of it, it's trying to tackle the fact that there are a lot of, like in retail, I suppose, in hospitality industries, where people are just not have
not made any provision, and employers haven't got a pension scheme. They may have PRSAs in place, but really this is trying to give access to a pension at a much earlier stage and have employers contribute to it. But I think there is a danger of mixing the two up, and it can be portrayed as a panacea for all problems. But we need to be aware that it will not necessarily address the drivers of a pension gap, because we have put this in our pre-budget submission. And we have also been lobbying quite strongly with Department of Social Protection. We have been discussing it at length with stakeholders that there's enhancements, there's some basic considerations that should be taken into the actual final outcome of this new auto enrollment scheme. And we're at that stage where we have an opportunity to make it as good as it can be. We do feel that the threshold of 20,000 as a salary entry point is still too high, and it's worth noting that actually there's a disconnect even from the minimum wage, which was announced this week, which is approximately 17,000 a year. So there's a disconnect there. The best in class countries that we would try to emulate, like Australia and New Zealand, either have a low threshold of maybe around 5,000 Australian dollars, or in New Zealand's case, no threshold at all, you know, and they give a kickstart to get people into an auto enrollment scheme.
So this threshold, what does that mean, Moya? That there won't be any opportunity for people earning less than that to join a pension?
That's exactly what that means at the moment.
So employers won't be obliged to put it in place for the employees below that?
Well, many people affected by this, and women again, are part-time workers and people on lower pay. So once again, it's negatively impacting one gender more than the other, because traditionally women are known to have more prominent in part-time work. Even the pandemic that we've seen just pass, there was a much larger proportion of women who lost their jobs, and while they got good support from the government on the pandemic payments, that did not contribute to their pension pot, and again that means later in life they're going to feel the consequences of it. So we would like to see some changes at a time before it becomes legislation in the auto enrollment scheme to address those. And I'm sure, Terry, you can comment too, the whole issue of those gaps in someone's career where they are not earning due to maternity or care duties. Well, the auto enrollment scheme does not cater for that, to allow them to make lump sum contributions, where you can do that in a private pension.
Terry, you might explain that bit about it as well to us.
Part of the problem with auto enrollment is the 20,000 salary is a problem, but you can opt in if you're underneath that. But the second point is the rigidity that's currently being proposed through the scheme. So what's being proposed at the moment is that neither the employee or the employer can increase their contributions or put lump sums into the contributions. So if you think back to what's causing the pensions gender gap, it is those periods of unpaid leave. So now you're going to be in a position where if you take time out of unpaid leave and you are in the auto enrollment scheme, you will have no mechanism to actually make that back up, because you will have no mechanism to increase contributions or put a lump sum through. It also makes it it's also very silent on the straw man in relation to what happens during maternity leave. So if you have a good employer like Lidl, for example, that pays your maternity leave, then your pension contributions keep going, and that's fine. But there is a lot of employers that don't top up the maternity leave. And the auto-enrollment scheme is utterly silent as to what happens at that point in time. And you've got to remember that the difficulty with unpaid leave is you lose the employee contribution, you lose the employer contribution, but you also lose the state contribution. It all disappears. So it would seem that the current auto-enrollment model is baking in a pensions gender gap. In New Zealand, where they've more flexibility, they've already got a 15% gap coming through the auto-enrollment scheme, and that is with kind of all the belts and braces that are there. And in particular, where they've made adjustments to the state pension scheme with the total contribution model to smooth out those periods of care so it doesn't impact on your state contribution, to now be proposing a completely new model that ignores these pension gaps or these gender gaps seems, quite extraordinary, to be honest.
And just to capture the amounts that we're talking about here, the proposal is that starting off, and over a 10-year period, starting off employers and employees will contribute 1.5% of their salary, and that will eventually, over 10 years, creep up to 6%, and then it gets capped, and that's it. 6% is...
Yeah, so if you think about it, it'd be 6% from the employee, 6% for the employer, and then 2% from the state, effectively, is the way it will work out. So that's 14% that you will lose entirely when you go on unpaid leave, with no way of making that back. So it really is something that we have also been engaging with stakeholders to urge that there needs to be a review of how the model is being structured, because we know right now that we are going to have a fairly large gender and pensions gap coming out of the auto-enrollment scheme.
Yeah. It's certainly something that feels a little bit overlooked again when the policy's being drawn up. Would that be correct to say, Moya? Or?
Well, I think, too often some of these societal issues are maybe viewed through one set of eyes or one gender set of eyes. And until you walk in my shoes or your shoes or whatever, these are where the problems arise. And I think looking at it from both genders, you have to say, look, it's a great thing to see the auto-enrollment come along and it's going to address some problems, but let's not miss an opportunity to, kill two birds with one stone, because it's very difficult to go back and introduce new legislation, and it takes too long. And every year that we have this prevailing, as Terry really succinctly put out there, it does have a big impact on that final income that you will be hoping to receive. And look, we see that the challenges of the cost of living nowadays, and unfortunately I'm not sure it's going to get any better when we all retire, and the cost of housing, the cost of rental, we need to make sure that we're taking wise steps now to make sure that people can live in a reasonable manner, and that they are reaping the benefits of their working lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Pensions should help us retire comfortably and not just survive, I suppose, is the key message here.
Absolutely. I think what's interesting about what Terry said as well is that the inflexibility that's there, that's what's concerning for me. Mention cost of living. So there'll be a time in your life where, you might have to focus on your finances going into a particular area, whether it's the deposit for the house or it's fees for college for kids, whatever that might be. There might be other times in your life then when you feel that you could put a bit more into your pension, and certainly with more education, that we learn more about how important that is, maybe doing it earlier and so on. But the fear with auto-enrollment schemes, that there's nothing there, there's no flexibility, and it's completely rigid, and you can't increase your contributions when you are in a position to do so, to help you out in the times where cost of living is really high, or there's additional costs on your as a person or as a family. I think that's concerning for those who won't have a separate occupational scheme, but the auto-enrollment scheme is going to be it, and that's going to be the pension of the future. I think that's a real worry.
And I think hopefully this week of Pensions Awareness Week will bring some of this to the fore for people, because a lot of people don't think about pensions at all. They are just thinking about the state and how that's going to support them when it comes to retirement, unless they have an employer who has a pension scheme available.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, Olive, the awareness. We need to raise awareness, not just with the end user and the women out there, but also with HR managers and HR directors, but also policymakers and legislators, that guys, you know, this is the outcome. If we had a looking glass now to say what's going to happen in the future, we're making problems for ourselves by not addressing these issues. And I think we, in our piece of research that we did in 2020 in Insurance Ireland, it was Dr. Claire Dale and Professor Susan St John from Australia and New Zealand respectively, and they were very clear about putting out there, ladies, a husband is not a pension, right? And I think society has changed for the better so much that, you know, people aren't necessarily, you know, it's the conventional couple is no longer there. People move jobs so frequently now, there has to be mobility and access to the pension that you want to have at the end. And you also have to take account that, you know, everybody's, you know, objectives and goals in life are different, you know, so we need a flexible mechanism to provide for that at the end of the day. And, you know, now's the time to do it.
Yes, get it right now.
And can I add, like we've spoke about auto-enrollment, like there's problems with occupational schemes as well that need to be addressed, because a lot of occupational scheme legislation is predicated on the theory that you are going to have a 40-year continuous service work lifespan, and that just doesn't happen, mostly for women, but also increasingly for men as well. You know, kind of we are living in a different world. And again, to go back to those periods of unpaid leave, you know, what we've seen in other countries, for example, in the UK, when you go on a period of unpaid leave, you don't lose the tax relief from the government side. They will give you a tax credit. So that goes into your pot. There's also have, you know, kind of tax efficient mechanisms whereby your partner can contribute to your pot during periods of time when you are on unpaid leave. And again, it allows for that flexibility to come through, none of which we have at the moment here, even on occupational schemes, let alone when we look forward into the auto-enrollment. So I think the whole pension scheme environment, legislation and public policy was put in place at a different time with a different view, and at a time when there was one kind of salary earner and they were there for the 40 years, and that's not the world we live in now. So I do think the whole pensions gender area from the pensions legislation needs to be gender proofed, and we're not there.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose to sum up, we are getting close to the end of the time here now. So I think what would be really useful at Pensions Awareness Week, we're always trying to give people actions to take away from our sessions. So maybe you could each maybe give a little tip to people to take away. Maybe from an employer point of view, what tip might you offer that employers could pick up on, starting maybe with that change in how to keep women in the workplace longer? Is there one?
I think there are lots of policies, lots of flexibility that employers can bring into the workplace to make it more inclusive for women, to keep women in the workforce for longer, to support women at different stages of their careers. We've talked a lot about maternity, but there are other times as well, whether it's early pregnancy loss, whether it's, as I said earlier, starting a family, having a family, later in life then as well, different times that flexibility around working, flexible working models, flexible working arrangements, to support women to stay and work for longer. I think for employers who are able to have an occupational pension scheme, that is certainly a huge benefit. And I think when you do, what's really, really important again is the education piece, and educating our employees, our female employees, our male employees too, as Terry said earlier, on what does that mean, and maybe preparing in advance rather than getting hit with a gap or a loss of salary or pension contribution, but thinking ahead. So earlier education for employees, financial advice, financial supports. Wellbeing is a huge topic for employers now, and I think along with physical well-being and mental well-being, I think the financial well-being part is something that we take very seriously, and I think that's for employers something that they really, really should look at into the future. Employees will expect it as well. We all know recruitment and retention is the hottest topic in town. So everything that we can do to support people in work, and when we're talking about the gender pension gap, then most particularly women, for longer, the better. Makes good business sense.
It does indeed.
Yeah.
And Terry, from maybe looking at the individual, what adjustments do you think, or tips could you give to people there?
I think the tips I'd give to employers would be, look at your pension scheme and make sure that it has got the flexibility for both the employer and the employee to be able to increase contributions if necessary. And look to see whether your pension scheme has a gender gap, and if you can afford to smooth it, the earlier you do that in the women's career, the better. For the employee, and again, it goes back to education. If you think that you will be taking periods of unpaid leave out, front load your contributions if you can afford them. So, start your pension as quickly as you can and as early as you can. Even small amounts make a big difference. But if you're coming up to that period where you think, God, might get married, might have children in 5-10 years' time, 1% more going into your pension scheme early on will bridge that gap into the future. And when you do come back from your maternity leave, if you have any capacity at all to increase your contributions again, it is well worth taking that pinch early, and then smoothing it out before you move forward. So again, it's more like, bear in mind that your salary is directly bolted to your pension. So if one goes missing, the other one goes missing as well.
Very good, very good. Moya, from the, I suppose, the policy side of things, which is closest to your heart, what would you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is an opportunity. What I would like to see happen is that the awareness and the driving causes of the pension gap need to be addressed now. I think it's a false economy to think that, well, that's going to cost money if we do that or we do this. You will still have to have some way of looking after your citizens, and in particular your female pensioners when it comes to the bit and they're retired, and it's going to cost an awful lot more. Equip them with the means to invest in their pensions with their employer, and they will be self-sufficient, or will be as near as possible in a better position to look after themselves and to be financially secure in their retirement. So I think it's, as I say, false economy, kicking the can down the road. It's going to cost money in the long run if we don't address it now and ensure that there is, we close that gender pension gap.
Yeah, very good. Well, on that note, I just say thanks to all our speakers today. Thank you very much. Fascinating contributions here and really interesting information, and I hope that this will, open the lid on this topic and get more people talking about it at the policy level, at employee and individual level, and get it out there so that people understand what's facing them and what's at stake. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So thank you all for joining us today, and hopefully you found this useful and that there is some information here that will get you thinking, and hopefully the tips that we've given here will help you as well. We're running sessions all week on pensionsawarenessweek.ie. There will be a session for people who want to start a pension, so that might be the next step for some people listening here today. We're also going to talk about how to keep your pension on track when you're midway through your career, and finally how to look after that pension pot before you retire, so things and actions you should take before you come to retirement. So really useful information. Check out their website, www.pensionsawarenessweek.ie, and you'll find lots of links in there to the sessions that are coming up and other facts that we can help you with in your pension journey. Thank you again for joining us, and thanks again to the panel, and take care, everybody.